Hi, everyone. I think we could slowly start. Thank you very much for joining us today. I am Christina, a member of Caucasus Edition's editorial team. And today I am with my colleagues, the Caucasus Edition's editorial team members, Lala Darchinova, Filip Gamaghelian, Vadim Ramashov, and Sevil Husseinova. And today we are here to discuss the situation, trying to make sense of the situation of the blockade caused by the blockade of Lachin Corridor, which was blocked on December 12th, and it's been more than 2 months that it's causing a humanitarian crisis and really also puzzling and causing uncertainty about the future and the possibilities for the Armenian Azerbaijani negotiations process. But before moving forward, we really want to take a moment to express our solidarity with the Syrian and Turkish societies that have suffered and continue to suffer the consequences of the destructive earthquake. Which is also very painful and devastating for us following the consequences of it. This is the second time that we as an editorial team have decided to join in such a public format to share our thoughts and discussions that we keep having continuously, to share it and open up with our followers and colleagues that we're happy to see joining us today. The first question that we want to start with is, again, trying to make sense of the situation. What are the causes of it and how can it be explained?
Thank you, Christina, for introducing us, and thank you everyone who joined. Frankly, it's quite an ungrateful task for me or any of us to start, and considering the situation is changing practically daily. And one of the reasons we were somewhat silent for the last 2 months was because it was very hard to make sense of what's happening. And by the time you do, new developments essentially come in place. But I'll try. So I'll try to, starting from answering the question, what's happening. So first of all, we have a very volatile geopolitical context that's probably not news to anyone, and specifically affecting this region. We see Iran-Azerbaijan tensions rising. Of course, Moscow's role is also very much in fluctuation and very much dependent on its war in Ukraine and consequent dependence on particularly Baku and a lot of other regional actors. And that's very much changing its own policies and politics or capability of acting in South Caucasus compared to, let's say, just a year or two ago. So I can go on, but I will try to not to go too deep into this geopolitical background, but just to show that there are, of course, many international developments that affect the region. Against this background, a very key development that led to the crisis today, in my view, is the collapse of the Charles Michel-led EU track of negotiations. As you might recall, on December 7th, there was supposed to be a meeting between Nikol Pashinyan and Ilham Aliyev in Brussels, and that meeting never took place, and that led to escalation. And the question now is, first of all, why these talks collapsed, and then how the escalation developed. Why the talks collapsed? I think there could be at least two, maybe more, but at least two reasons. Strictly internally, of course, geopolitically there were reasons for it, but still the parties, I think, were in a position to build on the format that was quite successfully working throughout the 2022. Two things happened. On Azerbaijani end, I believe that yes, Ilham Aliyev and the Azerbaijani government clearly being in a stronger position following the Second Karabakh War, overplayed its hand, just as following the First Karabakh War, I would say Armenian government overplayed its hand. Being in strong position and effectively having Nikol Pashinyan Armenian government renounced claims to Karabakh in terms of sovereignty, I think they pushed too far. essentially demanding things that are simply impossible for any Armenian government to see. So not only sovereignty over Karabakh, but denying any form of status or guarantees of security to the Karabakh Armenians, and even taking that completely off the table from negotiations or any kind of international involvement. And even if the Armenian government is not in a position to do anything about that, it's of course also not in a position, neither ethically nor in terms of internal politics, to accept such a fate or such a condition, considering that there is no indication that Azerbaijan will be treating the population Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh in any kind of a meaningful or humane way. Everything is going towards ethnic cleansing, and that's not something that any Armenian government would accept. There is also demands towards the enclaves, right? So actually the territories that during the Soviet times where there were some territories within Armenia that belonged to Azerbaijani Republic and vice versa. De facto, they passed to respective sites controls. And so there are many more of them in the Armenian territory. So if these are, we go back to the 1980s maps, essentially the whole road practically connecting Armenia with Georgia and the road to the south, big parts of it will then fall under Azerbaijani control, and that poses simply an existential threat to the viability of Armenia. Again, another condition that's very hard to accept. And the third one, and the most probably spoken about, is the Zangezur Corridor, or the extraterritoriality of a connection from mainland Azerbaijan to Nakhchivan. And here, even though, as I understand, Azerbaijan doesn't demand necessarily extraterritorial control, as in Armenia ceding territory, it does demand unrestricted control through the Armenian territory, and that on its own is also not acceptable necessarily, not for Armenia, but potentially also for Iran and other actors. So there have been conditions that simply push too far, making it very hard, if not impossible, for the Armenian government to accept. But there is also the Armenian side's major responsibility for the collapse. And I would unfortunately say that it looks like it didn't learn many negotiation lessons from 2018, 2019, in a sense of believing that it can cancel existing formats of negotiations and just dream up a new one at will. If 2018-19, that applies to Madrid principles and essentially canceling them as unrealistic as they were, and trying to propose some new format in return that never materialized. Instead, we ended up in a war. Currently, too, there was an agreed upon and functioning trilateral format, Michel, Aliyev, Pashinyan, and by Pashinyan trying to demand some kind of a new quadrilateral format and include Emmanuel Macron into the negotiations without, in my understanding, any agreement with neither Aliyev nor Michel. That simply canceled the format so far without necessarily any agreement on a new one. So and thus we don't have negotiations, just as we didn't have in, say, 18-19, the escalation becomes inevitable. And then a couple of words about why it escalated the way it did and very different from the past. All the previous escalations were violent, right? All the from 2016 and 15 on, including in post-Second Karabakh War, they were all violent. Something changed. What changed was that the September escalation, that was the most massive one, not only led to massive loss of life, almost equivalent to the 2016, what we called four-day war. There's massive loss of life on both sides, actually, but also was not well received, neither internationally nor domestically in Azerbaijan. Right? If there wasn't consensus in a society to fight and die potentially for Karabakh, there was no consensus in a society to die for attacking Armenia. So I think not being able to escalate militarily and not having societal consensus, the Azerbaijani government just looked for more creative, quote-unquote, measures. And then we have the blockade of the Lachin Corridor. So I'll stop there and pass the word to my colleagues.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you. I guess you have covered most of the geopolitical background and the preceding development in the official process. Sevil, I want to ask you, maybe if you could describe, I think it would be interesting to learn what are, how this was covered in the Azerbaijani media, what are the main narratives around the blockade, in the Azerbaijani media and among civil society actors, especially that everything has started with the ecological protest, presumably. Yes, please.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you, Phil, for your overview. Actually, I was going to talk about the situation in the Lachin Corridor and how it's portrayed in Azerbaijan and what people think about it. This action of so-called activists gathered in the Lachin Corridor is not called a blockade. Even more or less independent media, public intellectuals, critics of the authorities and bloggers agree in their public statements that the population of Karabakh is not starving. Photos with feasts, weddings are circulated, convoys of transport are shown heading to Karabakh, and therefore there is no blockade as such. Further, it's asserted that the civic activists who blocked the road have the right to do so. It's their civic duty, and they honorably perform it. After 2 months, no one even remembers the climate demands, and the role of the activist is perceived as part of a well-planned and well-thought-out policy. Everyone understands in Azerbaijan perfectly well that without the support of the authorities, these actions would not have been there. On the whole, majority perceive them as heroes. They are supported, they are given moral support, etc. So in my view, this is a new tactic. Phil mentioned it, by our authorities, using new formats of pressure on Karabakh and Armenia with the involvement of a previously unused resource, that is civil society representatives. According to the activists themselves and the authorities, this action is non-violent in nature. So it's a kind of non-violent method of pressure. And we observe that this set of methods of pressure on the opponent has expanded. Then a question arises. Why do the authorities avoid talking about the blockade? I think that, first of all, it's actually a military term. It's used in a situation of war. Azerbaijan is trying not to go far and open a confrontation with Russia. The second point is very important for Azerbaijan as well. It's a question of its image as a European partner in the energy sector. Furthermore, according to the official discourse, the conflict no longer exists and the Nagorno-Karabakh problem has been solved. It's this winner's discourse, the discourse of victory, which is being actively created, and the commemoration of victory, which reduce public support for further military escalations. The latest escalation in September did not generate much enthusiasm or support among the population. Around 100 Azerbaijani citizens were killed within 1 or 2 days. And the main thing is that no obvious results were achieved. What did these soldiers die for? For a corridor that was never opened? The Azerbaijani authorities have found themselves in a kind of discursive trap. The myth of the end of the conflict and victory is driving them into a deadlock. If it's over, why do large numbers of soldiers continue to die? Hence, the attempts to look for new methods of pressure. And the specificity of the moment is that after such a prolonged effort, the Azerbaijani authorities or activists simply can no longer leave the corridor empty-handed. It therefore seems to me that the blockade will probably continue until some concessions are made, which can be presented to Azerbaijani society as another important achievement. Another point to which I would like to draw your attention relates to the topic of the return of the so-called Western Azerbaijanis. This topic is not new, but right now it's taking on an intensive character of discussion. President Aliyev emphasized this problem in his last interview, and it's also kind of discursive pressure on Armenia, along with the Lachin crisis, to speed up the signing of a peace treaty and the opening of corridor to Nakhchivan. Aliyev has promised that this year, 2023, should be the decisive year for achieving the goals the authorities have set for themselves. That is, a peace treaty, resolution of the Karabakh issue, issues of demarcations, delimitation, and the issue of Zangezur Corridor. Such a promise would require the achievement of at least some of these goals. Thank you. I stop here, and maybe colleagues will add something.
Thank you, Sev. Lala, Vadim, I want to also ask you to comment if you have anything to add to the conflict analysis. One question that I have in mind is, are there any critical voices about this in Azerbaijani civil society, for example? Is there any criticism of this situation?
Well, I think there is criticism and there are critical voices, but of course they are marginal as always, as they have been during the 2020 war, and these critical voices are not enough to change the mainstream narrative or to counter this narrative. But just to add to what the colleagues already mentioned, I was also thinking, I have more questions than answers, to be honest, but as all of us do, but I was thinking about main Azerbaijani interests around this blockade and what they could achieve and how long they can continue this blockade and how this might end actually, in which form. And my personal assumption is that Azerbaijan has multiple goals with this blockade. One would be the immediate and short term is to try to establish control of the Lachin Corridor. Second, to pressure on Armenia to continue the peace negotiations or somehow to come to an agreement. And the third one, in my opinion, is trying to basically move out ethnic Armenians from the Nagorno-Karabakh, which seems the only viable option for Azerbaijani government right now. And the last one, I think they are also thinking about the situation with Russian peacekeepers, which is going to be a main problem for Azerbaijani government in less than 2 years already. So this can also be another pressure point on them. And then in this situation, I would say why we have this blockade. Then there is also the collide of interest with Russian peacekeepers and Azerbaijani authorities, which also contributes to the situation on the ground. But then the question would be how long it can continue, and how Azerbaijani authorities can get out of this situation. For me, honestly, I don't have high hopes. It's either another huge escalation or a peace agreement, basically. But for peace agreement, they antagonized Armenians to such a level with September escalation and now with this blockade that I don't see personally any perspective for the peace agreement, which leaves us with another escalation, another round of escalations. I will stop here, and I would like to hear more from the colleagues on this matters.
Thank you, Lala. Before moving forward, something that I forgot to mention for our audience is that we have a Q&A section. You can see it on your screens. Please submit your questions and comments there, and we will do our best to address as many as possible during the second half of our webinar today. Maybe we could try to move forward to understanding, and Lala, I think you slowly moved there with your comment of possible scenarios and what are the possible ways out, and also the role of peace building and peace practitioners in this. Vadim, would you like to start? And also please feel free to comment on the first question as well, if anything is left unsaid.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you, colleagues. Yeah, you have covered very well the situation there and all these questions which are still remaining and open, what actually is still going on there. I would like maybe to cover a bit and build up on what Lala has mentioned. She mentioned that the position of Russian troops, Russian peacekeeping troops in this situation, and as a kind of that the blockade creates a certain pressure point on them. And I wonder, yes, exactly from which perspective to approach the current situation. Like, I mean, if we take considering so-called Russia's interests in this situation. So apparently there is a kind of double-edged sword in this case. So apparently the pressure on the military presence in Karabakh of Russia's peacekeeping troops is taking place on from both sides, from Armenian officials and also from the rather more like Azerbaijani media discourse, right? That Russian peacekeepers here do not really create a peace, but rather another form of occupation. So this kind of discourse has increased even more. Also on the side of Armenian, there also even at the level of officials, there is a kind of clear expression of disappointment of the approach of Russia's peacekeepers on the ground, that they do not really try to get engaged with the issue, trying to solve it and somehow deblockade the corridor. And apparently, in this case, it's created a kind of really kind of pressuring point on their presence, and that also may create a certain backlash from the military backlash from the Russia side, since of course the military presence is there both in the Karabakh and in Armenia. So even though that apparently blockade can be considered as a kind of non-violent or non-military kind of way to create a problem in the region, but at the same time it has clear military dimension, because the Russian peacekeepers are there. Also the presence of Azerbaijani military is basically next to them, so there is a kind of clear military dimension, but that can create a huge problem in case of escalation. At the same time, if we consider what could be certain interests of Russia's government not to really get involved in the issue, try to deblockade the corridor. Probably it's also this kind of artificial, maybe even reluctance to do something on this. It could be a pressure, like responding pressure point on the Armenian officials in terms of negotiation process, like larger political processes. Phil has mentioned that the EU's EU-initiated, EU-supported negotiation process somehow has failed at the moment. But at the same time, it could be also because it was definitely not in the interests of Russia's government that tried to preserve to maintain their negotiation process. And so what I think now, coming to the question of the possible scenarios and ways out, like from the political perspective, of course there is a clear issue here that there are two confronting, not even competing, but apparently confronting negotiation tracks. One is led by brokered by the Russia's officials and diplomats, and then another one by the EU. and they are not in line with each other, because apparently the main kind of goal of both of these tracks is to push out either EU side or Russia side from the negotiation track, so that the conflict would not be managed in the interest of whether one or the other side. So they are really competing on this track. And this is a very different situation, of course, that was, for example, when we had this Minsk group. So at that time, even though there was a certain competition, but at least the Minsk group had this certain coordination mechanism. So there was not really like, there was a competition, but now what we see like real confrontation. And apparently without solving this issue first, we will either end up in a political deadlock. So nothing will really move on in terms of achieving peace agreement or certain treaty. Or in the worst scenario, we will end up in a military clash, another escalation that maybe will be even larger than the one that we had in 2020. So like a war that would already drag not only the Armenia, Azerbaijan, but also Russia's forces into that. And of course, increasing escalation will maybe involve even Turkish troops and maybe even NATO, but of course it's already quite dramatic scenario. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Philippe Seville, would you like to comment on this question as well? And yeah, before moving forward one more time, I want to invite our audience members to submit questions and comments, and we'll try to address them, and we'll read them after this round of comments as well. And yes, please, Sev.
Yeah, I agree with Vadim that the situation is quite heated right now, and the possibility of violence is very high, but not only by militaries, not only by peacekeepers, Russian troops or some other troops there, but by people, by some radicals, for instance, yeah, because it's actually the question who is controlling the situation. It's a really good question, and even some radical escalation might be out of control of Azerbaijan authorities, for instance, or Armenian authorities. So this is also a kind of scenario of escalation on the ground by some radicals. Another point, I think that the blockade is going on for more than 2 months right now, and that is not a short period of time, but it could take a long time and turn into such a practice of permanent pressure. So I think that in short period scenario, this blockade might turn to kind of permanent situation. And by this tactic, actually, this tactic is not new. As you know, that Armenia is in blockade for 30 years by Azerbaijan and Turkey. But the blockade, the prolonged blockade, the situation could change dramatically. And the format of relations and the power relations in Karabakh could change. For instance, if this action, which is now consists of activists, so-called activists, turn into the permanent checkpoint, which is actually Azerbaijani authorities are willing to do. So this will change the format of relations in Karabakh. Another point, I think that if we talk about a little bit midterm scenario, that and lots of experts also agree that the major armed escalation in Karabakh could not happen before 2005. By the end of this 5-year term of the peacekeepers, Azerbaijan will do everything to get them out of Karabakh. And many, of course, also depend on how events in Ukraine develop on the battlefield. So yeah, there's lots of scenarios, but in a long-term period, I would not dare to say something in long-term period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil.
Yeah, since there are a few questions to answer here, yeah. So one to comment on what the colleagues shared, but also talk about the scenarios, and also some questions are coming up that are relevant on this topic. So first of all, in my view, at least, there are some, of course, policies involved here, and they are slowly pursued. At the same time, I think the escalation is somewhat, there's also somewhat reactionary, and opportunities are being taken, and also risks are developing as we go, in a sense that, whether this would last 2 months or 4 months, right? So that seems to be more of a situational and opportunistic. By the way, no more by the positive development, and hard to call positive, but right now you have Turkish and Armenian foreign ministers today meeting in Turkey and discussing suddenly normalization against a very, very tragic event. So developments are practically daily. So in that sense, it's very hard to predict, and I think actors are reactive, and not only proactive necessarily in all of this, which is, again, both good and bad. The bigger problem behind this is that there is no framework agreement. There is no kind of agreed upon grand strategy towards which to move, which in a way exists in Turkey-Armenia, right? So there was in principle agreement to normalize. And, yes, there are political developments that prevent it, but in general, you see the trajectory, and once there is an possibility, sides do some steps towards each other and they move towards some form of normalization. We don't have anything like this on Armenia-Azerbaijan track. There is no essentially any kind of framework agreement, even on basics, so that then sides could move forward to. And considering that, I agree with Cyril, others as well, that as we approach 2025, it just becomes more and more risky. If we talk about scenarios from that bigger perspective, I think there are a lot of risks involved because, in absence of any kind of an agreement, risks then will overwhelm. And yet, yes, Azerbaijan is stronger in a short to medium term. Again, Armenia had upper hand earlier, but having become an area of proxy conflict is not going to be left to only Armenia and Azerbaijan to sort out, which one-on-one, yes, Azerbaijan is stronger currently, but it's inevitably will draw in Iran, inevitably will, as weak as Russia might be internationally, not weak enough for our region, presumably, and Turkey and other actors. So it will become, the more we escalate, essentially, the more we are becoming as a region cards essentially in somebody else's game, up to loss of sovereignty, right? So this just, again, it's not a given. We didn't necessarily have it for centuries. These last 30 years might look like an exception rather than the rule moving forward. So I do see a lot of very big risks if we don't find a framework agreement moving forward, and right now we don't have it. And if I could, I just see a comment by Zaur Shiriev in the chats that I personally said earlier that the EU track collapsed, and I should accept that, yes, the wording was too harsh. It certainly didn't collapse, and I think it's in a crisis rather. It's right now, they're not meeting in Brussels. I think the criticism from my end was more directed to the Armenian government in this case for essentially proposing an alternative format without kind of negotiations about the format itself. But clearly, European Union has have had and continues to have a pretty strong presence since the Second Karabakh War, currently putting forward a longer-term monitoring mission in Armenia, and certainly, yes, I probably spoke by mentioning collapse. It's just not happening yet, and yet it's because it's not happening, it might escalate to a point when, right, either other actors take more of an active role, or it might be too late to go back to because things escalate too far on the ground. So if it's possible to get back to that format, would be good to see the developments soon. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And I see we have many questions, and from my side, just one last question, and then maybe we could move to the ones from the audience. Is then in all that uncertainty and the anticipation of new escalations, what is the role of what can be done by peace practitioners. Lala, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, good question. I think we are witnessing the instrumentalization of civil society right now from Azerbaijani side. It was always like that, like they instrumentalize it, but now the interesting point for me is that they are mobilized for a nationalist cause, and in many cases it's very voluntary, like people go not just because government wants it, but because they also want it, because it's for national interest, for its they are uniting against an enemy. So this is a sad observation for me, this instrumentalization that's happening. And what I see as a way out for peace practitioners, it's to invest and to unite a cross-border level, and preferably even regional level. Otherwise, alone, I think we are too weak and unable to resist the hegemonic narratives in our countries. So for me, the most possible solution right now for peace builders, for any peace practitioners, activists, would be to unite into coalition, into anti-war, or let's say pro-peace coalition that can become strong and can resist this kind of developments, and can become a strong voice for anyone in the region who is against the war. And I think such union, or such coalition can be built around universal values. It shouldn't be necessarily anti-war, but it would be the best way would be to put it in a more universal values that can unite activists on both sides. And we see it, actually. We see in the different initiatives emerging, uniting around different ideas, be it feminist ideas, be it climate activist ideas, etc. So this is happening. And I think there was also a question in the chat how internationals can contribute to this. I think internationals can contribute to this by supporting this kind of emergence of this kind of coalitions and making them more stronger and trying to give them space and voice. For me, this is the most realistic solution right now that I see among peace builders. And along with this kind of cross-border or regional initiatives, I also see the value and need for strong grassroots mobilization and working with the people on the ground, because I think we are really detached. At some points we become very, I would say, even elitist, doing our analysis and predictions, but not really reflecting on what's going on the ground with people, what are their real needs. So in-country grassroots that can work with the people and that can become a social base for peace, basically. So also investment in this and building this kind of strong grassroots initiatives would be another solution, in my opinion. Yeah.
Vadim, Sevil, Philip, would you like to add any remarks to this?
Yeah, I second what Lala, of course, has said, and especially I believe that exactly this kind of new way of approaching the conflict, creating this pressure through civil society, discredits a lot. In general, the civil society, those who are like genuine civil society, and including peace building community, and but so it's kind of happening by the nowadays also with the involvement of the government. But of course, yes, exactly, nationalist forces, they are also getting stronger positions in their discourses and interventions. They are radicalizing. They are working on the ground more actively, especially there are some initiatives to militarize society, so like providing military training, creating like fortifications along the border. So it also comes like kind of grassroots initiative rather than top-down initiative. So that also creates a kind of a big issue that nationalized or nationalistic civil society is grassroots initiatives. They're getting more and more ground in the region, while the pro-peace peace building community or civil society is losing its ground because they're not working that closely with people in their everyday life as they could have done it and could do it still in the moment, because of course it's important to show an alternative to people, that there is not only the war, which is an unavoidable future scenario, but there are also possibilities to work for peace, also on the ground in the everyday lives. And so I think that's very important for the peace building community actually to and maybe also through broadening the agenda of peace building. Of course, nowadays to speak about peace becomes almost in some cases a suicide, which because of the warmongering is increasing everywhere. But at least like a widening and broadening agenda, including the issues of social inequity or environmental justice, which will be approached like from real environmentalist activists together with peace builders, would create an alternative to what we see now in Karabakh. So I think is very important, and so yeah, by doing this, we may create a larger social basis that can be mobilized for peace in both societies and even beyond that. And that would be working to prevent the possible worst scenario. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vadim. Colleagues, if you don't mind, I will now move to our questions. I want to really apologize that this time we don't have the chance for joining the panel. And I really want to invite everyone to submit questions, although we already have 13 questions, and we will go through them in order of them being submitted, and yeah, we'll try to address as many as possible. So the first two questions are from Margarita Tadevosyan. She's asking first, there has been a lot of talk about Ruben Vartanyan's role in triggering the blockade, or at least contributing to its continuity. And she's asking if at all, if he has a role to play, or he is just a convenient pretext for Azerbaijani government, or he actually does have some leverage in this situation. And the second question is about if the establishment of checkpoints in Lachin Corridor will be a trade-off that will be seen enough by Azerbaijan, and for how long that would be enough, in quotes. Colleagues who would like to address any of these questions. The role of Ruben Vartanyan and the possibility of checkpoints being a long-term or short-term solution to the crisis that we're facing right now.
Well, maybe from Azerbaijani perspective, I can start. I think Ruben Vardanyan is seen as someone installed by Russia in NK, and from his first appearance there, Azerbaijani media and Azerbaijani authorities clearly said that we are not going to negotiate with him, associating him with the Russia. And first I was thinking maybe this can be a pretext, but then after brainstorming and talking to many experts and to internationals, the conclusion that I came is that yeah, he is a problem for Azerbaijan. At least Azerbaijan sees him as a problem for negotiating with the NK Armenians on the ground. And the second part of the question, about checkpoints, I think it's a short-term solution for Azerbaijan. In the long term, after establishing the control over the Lachin Corridor, until the full resolution of the conflict, from Azerbaijani perspective, meaning that until the NK on a peace agreement accepted by Armenia as a part of Azerbaijan, this will be continuing and ongoing. So control of the Lachin Corridor is just a short-term gain for Azerbaijani side.
Vadim?
Yeah, just would maybe quickly add to that point that somehow, yeah, we disregarded this in our discussion today and in general, but I think it's very important. It's good that Margarita mentioned that that internal Karabakh politics, of course, also one of the factor that influence somehow what is happening there, because there are rumors of increasing confrontation, political confrontation in Karabakh on the between Arutunian and Vardanian, and of course there are some interests involved. So like preferences, Russia's preferences in terms of who would be the best leader of the region at this time. So apparently there is this kind of involvement and factor that influences the situation, but unfortunately these are rather internal politics, that I don't have much knowledge about. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and since we are discussing Karabakh, and we do have a challenge by viewer here, that essentially the question, if I can summarize, would be why don't we have Karabakh voices, which I think is a very valid question. So we did reach out to, and I think the real importance is that the person asking is not located in Karabakh, but abroad. And important part here, we did reach out to colleagues in Karabakh, and we so far were declined to join. And I think, in my view, it was very legitimate decline of participation in a webinar currently on two grounds. One is that there is enough public information available, and the people from Karabakh to speak up enough to to international media to be heard for anybody who would like to hear them. Along with just not wanting to currently to be in a screen with Azerbaijani colleagues, even if those who are peace builders, for the way it might be perceived not only internally but also externally. So I personally found these reasons valid. The invitation stands open, and whenever any colleague located in Karabakh or who's been spending a considerable time there recently is willing to talk to us, we are very much open. The platform will remain open. So that's that comment. And then continue building on what also Lala and others said, the blockade and the way it opens up, I think, and any kind of scenarios in that direction, it will hopefully sooner or later open up. The problem is it looks like it's already a playbook is in place for essentially slowly pressuring the population to leave, right? So if it's not 2025, some kind of physical military attack, so there might be slower ethnic cleansing through blockade and essentially making life impossible in a very kind of everyday sense. So that does, in my view, require a very strong investment into the solution, which I don't want to take more time. I'll answer to this commenting on other questions of how it's possible to move forward. But it's just, I think there's a lot of focus on the humanitarian end of things and opening the corridor. And I think it's absolutely necessary. It should be, of course, a priority. It just doesn't prevent anything, including a checkpoint, doesn't preclude it from closing on a weekly basis or monthly basis anytime there is a need to put a political pressure. So while, yes, by all means, it should be opened right now for humanitarian reasons, we do need to look for a framework agreement to prevent this from happening over and over until there is no Armenian left in Karabakh.
There's a question from Sarah C. He's asking, can you please provide us with tangible actions we can take to drive for solutions?
So legal binding, and the question specifically was looking into UN and other international mechanisms. That would be great to have some of these in place once there is an agreement, but let's be realistic that UN today or no international framework is in a position simply to say impose an agreement. It's as simple as if in 90s it was not possible, today it's should not possible at all. Right? In 90s could have been somewhat possible in the sense that there was these international organizations were as strong as ever. There was more or less a consensus worldwide in investing into structures such as UN and working OSCE and working through them. And even then, Armenia and Azerbaijan essentially both or different times and sometimes simultaneously sabotaged any progress in negotiations, despite quite united at times international effort helping us to move towards a solution. We essentially didn't want to prefer the confrontation. If that happened in 90s, yeah, when it was a more or less stability internationally and acceptance of international structures, it's absolutely impossible to imagine it today when the superpowers are not cooperating in any framework and essentially engaged in proxy wars now in Ukraine, in Syria, and elsewhere. So these structures are simply, not functional unless the sides themselves come to an agreement. From that point on, then let me just take on why and how we can come to an agreement. And again, I do believe it's only up to Armenia and Azerbaijan to be able to agree. Otherwise, we are very easy picking for international actors to play us against each other for their own interests. How to move towards agreement then in bilateral format? I'll put this conceptual problem that I see, that we are discussing this conflict in two dimensions. One is the primordialist. It's essentially like we are genetically incompatible, a famous phrase pronounced by former Armenian President Kocharyan. But it's not only Kocharyan, although he's the most famous one saying that, let's say, that's a very commonly accepted position on a political level, on the level of academia in Armenia and Azerbaijan. We basically don't see each other as genetically compatible and see each other as in constant threat and being in constant war. So that's one discourse that's very dominant. And within that, of course, you cannot find any solution because you are simply by blood enemies. Which again is absolutely disproven, of course, in no academic sense, in no any serious sense, that conversation of blood enmity is possible, is straight up racism, and yet somehow we base politics on that. And the second discourse that is somewhat opposed to it and proposes something somewhat of more realistic way out is realism, is the school of international relations, school of realism, which talks about putting aside this kind of blood conversation and focusing on realpolitik and making kind of rational calculations about the way out. And unfortunately, that also is a way to war, right? So you might as well calculate that you are better off. And Armenia calculated for 30 years that they are better off holding the status quo and confrontation as opposed to compromising. Today, Azerbaijan thinks it's calculates, it's has an upper hand and gonna demand all it can, right? So that on its own, while very, I prefer by far to the blood struggle, of course, argument, this is also one only option for talking about solution. And unfortunately, we don't have a third. Yeah, so, and there were other attempts to think about conflict, such as from liberal perspective of United Nations and international cooperation that didn't stick so far. But I think very important one for analysts, the community, for peace builders, is to break this monopoly, I would say, on discourse from these primordialists who talk about blood struggle and from realists who essentially talk about calculated struggle, which then ends up still in an ongoing war. Because these are not the only two frameworks, right? So these have been maybe popular in 19th century and first half of 20th century. But there are many other frameworks of looking into conflict. And again, it requires a longer conversation, but really reframing conflict, trying to think of the identities differently. So the identity of Armenian or Azerbaijan, it doesn't need to be in any kind of violent struggle against neighbors for its survival or its prosperity. So there are many other ways of thinking about identity, about conflict, that we can still have a conflict. It just doesn't need to be a violent one, right? So we can look around the world and see many conflicts and many groups coexisting in a space, same countries or neighborhoods, who don't agree with each other, who don't like each other, and yet they don't need to be in violent confrontation with each other, and be able to manage their conflicts through essentially agreed upon peaceful means. So I think moving in that direction of confrontation with each other, contesting our differences in a peaceful way, I think that's potentially a way to move forward rather than a solution, which I don't think is necessarily possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Because we're almost out of time, I suggest we maybe take up to 10 more minutes and address one more question. And there is a question about Armenian-Turkey relations and its impact on Armenian-Azerbaijani process. So maybe we could address that one as well and try to close the conversation. So the questions from Anush, and again we had and then we have following couple of more questions, similar questions from the other audience members. The question goes, so is there any hope that what it seems to be an intensifying normalization process between Armenia and Turkey could play a positive role in establishing regional cooperation and help the normalization process of Armenian and Azerbaijani relations?
If I may start very shortly and briefly about this, I think from Azerbaijani side, it's any kind of normalization without NK normalization or NK resolution is perceived with jealousy, I would say. Even now, when Armenian MFA traveling to Turkey in media, it's not really perceived positively. So my opinion is that without tangible results on Armenia-Azerbaijani relations, I don't expect any normalization on Armenia and Turkey relations. But in overall, if this normalization happens, I think that's something that can actually stabilize and normalize the security issues in the region.
Sevil, Philip, Vadim, would you like to address this question as well?
Well, in general, I would say, of course, yeah, from the peace research perspective, every normalization is should be considered as a positive for cooperation in the region and bringing some more peaceful coexistence of countries. But of course, the question is in the larger framework of this, or the larger context. And in case of, well, we have kind of certain kind of strategic cooperation, or maybe, it's hard to say it cooperation, but rather certain intensified relationship between Russia and Turkey on different dimensions, especially like in the global geopolitical scale. So apparently there is this factor that that is involved, but also if if the normalization process would be seen from the Russia's perspective as it is kind of another attempt to push away the influence, the presence of Russia in the region, that could be considered as an escalatory step from the Russia's government, but of course that could create some other tensions in the region. But yeah, it's hard to guess now when the process is still taking its first steps.
Yeah, I think that everyone now is discussing or looking forward to see the answer of the suggestion of Armenia on peace treaty, which was circulated in the media. But I think that without the third party, without the Karabakh, it's actually impossible to normalize the relations, because this format should be trilateral, not bilateral. And this is the problem. And I think that the dialogue between Armenia and Karabakh is needed, actually. Yeah, what we are observing right now, that Karabakh has its own agenda. It's much more revanchist, it's much more nationalistic. If we see some kind of signs of peace party in Armenia. There is no such signs in Karabakh. And even Vardanyan's saying in his last interview, which was highly discussed in Azerbaijan, about it actually is a continuation of the discourse of Kocharan about that two ethnicity cannot live together. Yeah, he's not talking about neighbors, as Phil mentioned. He's talking about that we should tolerate each other, living not together, but living just close to each other. This is actually the problem, that no one is actually really wants these dialogues. This is the main, I think, obstacle in normalization of relations and the conflict.
Philip, would you like to add anything? And maybe I will just also ask the last question, because it's I think there were a couple of questions from the audience as well about this, and apologies for my picture. I see it's very blurred right now. Yeah, well, it's about again going back to the question of what can be done in this situation, and how do you guys see what is the role for us in all this?
So yeah, I guess so I'll take it on. I don't think in current situation any solution as such is possible. So while peace agreements are good and necessary, I still see them as an element of conflict management. I don't think the conflict will stop because there is a paper signed somewhere, although the paper is better than absence of paper. So in that sense, I've been saying this before, and somebody was surprised recently and even confronted me for saying that Cyprus is a solution. It's not a Cyprus scenario. It's not a solution as such, but it's again a conflict without violent confrontation that is managed through non-violent means. I think is as good as it can get anytime soon. So moving while we are living again through very turbulent times internationally and locally, trying to again find formula or approaches through which we can manage this relationship non-violently, while understanding that this enmity and 30-40 years now of violence and conflict and displacement will linger for another good 100 years. It's not that easy to forgive each other for everything that happened, but it's important not to continue escalating the way we are currently doing. So even if we stop the escalation on its own, it will take a few decades to get past the enmity that we created. So in that sense, yeah, looking for an agreement, again, an agreement that can help us have this conflict in a non-violent way. And some of my colleagues here mentioned this term numerous times in the past, agonistic peace. So I'll just borrow it from you if you don't mind. I heard it from Vadim and Lala and Christina, but since none of you mentioned that, I'll throw it in here. The agonistic peace being the idea that of being in a kind of permanent or long-term confrontation is just agreeing on the rules of the game. Yeah, so not have to be violent confrontation and having to manage the confrontation through other means. I think that's a very realistic, the most realistic and meaningful scenario to look towards. Yeah, find a way to have a disagreement, strong disagreement about Karabakh status and identity and the past and what else. Just outruling violence that makes us essentially a prey in the hands of bigger actors. So that would be my, I'm not happily ever after, but let's have a conflict in a less confrontational way proposal.
Yeah, I'll join Phil, and I agree on agonistic peace, but I would like to go back to my initial argument, which I started this presentation. I believe in people's resistance, and I believe in resistance from Armenians and Azerbaijanis who don't want war anymore and who believe in peace and coexistence together. We have our grievances, all of us, and we hurt each other, yeah, many times, but it cannot continue like this anymore. And people, whoever agrees with this, can, I think, organize in a movement, can organize in a in a coalition that can resist this nationalistic warmongering discourse. This is what we really need. And I'm happy to see here or there this kind of initiatives emerging, but it should become stronger, it should become more vocal, and it should try to alter the narrative that we have right now. And this is what I believe in, and this is the only solution, in my opinion, right now, that is more or less realistic. Otherwise, to be honest, I'm very pessimistic about the future and about the fate of our conflict, let's say. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like just to add to Lala's point about creating this wider coalition of peace-minded people from Armenia, Azerbaijan. But of course, since what Phil mentioned, there is unfortunately that we are living in general in very turbulent geopolitical situation nowadays in the world. And of course, it's important that people from different countries get united, because nowadays the solution cannot be only for one particular case, one particular conflict, when there are interests of global powers involved. So there is rather a need for people from different countries get united and solve, not really solve, but at least like creating this possibility, a space for agonistic peace, at least together, rather than, of course, relying on some concrete case. We need to think about more globally, maybe at this stage of history. Thank you.
I want to thank you for your contribution, and thank our audience members for your actively submitting their questions. And I think showing care for this topic and trying to understand and explore alternatives. And I think this situation, the ongoing situation right now with this closed Lachin Corridor, truly creating a humanitarian crisis, and it's been 3 decades, and that we are, Lala, as you mentioned, are hurting each other. And I think the least we could do is try to look forward, and search for alternatives and solutions that will end violence, and we could find that agonistic way of still arguing and trying to hear each other out, and trying to become vocal about our grievances and issues, but without engaging in violence, without threatening each other's security and lives. And thank you again for being with us today. We will continue our series of webinars. Please follow us on Facebook and social media for updates. This webinar is recorded, so you can find the recordings of our previous webinars, as well as this one on our YouTube channel. Thank you very much.